Throughout history, kings have ruled with crowns of gold and swords of steel, their power stretching across lands and lives. But behind the grandeur of palaces and thrones lies a darker truth: when kings turned cruel, their wrath became more terrifying than war itself. In ages when monarchs were seen as chosen by God, their punishments were not simply justice but spectacles meant to remind subjects of their absolute authority. And nothing revealed this more than the savage executions they ordered, deaths so brutal they carved fear into the hearts of generations. In medieval and early modern Europe, royal executions were designed not only to kill but to humiliate and terrify. Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated Queen of England, once basked in the splendor of Henry VIII's court. But the same king who once adored her condemned her to death when her influence waned. In 1536, she was led to the scaffold, her neck severed by a French swordsman in one swift stroke. Though swift, her death was not merciful. It was a warning to all that even queens were not safe from a king's fury. But not all executions were so clean. Some kings preferred punishments that dragged victims through pain and horror. Ivan IV of Russia, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, relished cruelty that stretched beyond reason. His executions were public theater, where noblemen were roasted over fires, impaled on stakes, or torn apart by wild beasts as the Tsar watched with cold satisfaction. To defy him was to invite not only death but the most creative forms of agony. Even beyond Europe, rulers demonstrated their cruelty through death. In ancient China, emperors commanded punishments that ensured no legacy remained of the condemned. Entire families could be executed under the law of nine kinship extermination, where a single act of treason meant fathers, mothers, children, and distant relatives all perished together. The execution itself was brutal, but the message was harsher: in the shadow of the throne, no one's bloodline was sacred. These executions were more than moments of punishment, they were performances of terror. Kings turned death into theater, making examples of those who betrayed them, defied them, or simply fell out of favor. For the victims, there was no escape, no appeal, no mercy. And for the crowds who watched, it was a reminder that loyalty was not a choice, it was survival. When kings turned cruelty into spectacle, executions became nightmares carved into history. In France, the fate of Damiens in 1757 remains one of the most infamous examples. Accused of attempting to assassinate King Louis XV, he was not granted the swift mercy of the blade. Instead, he was dragged into a public square, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, boiling oil and molten lead poured into his wounds. Finally, his limbs were tied to horses, each whipped until the body tore apart in a grotesque display of power. This was not justice, it was terror performed before thousands, ensuring that no subject would ever dare raise a hand against a king again. In England, executions of nobles and traitors often carried a symbolic cruelty. Those accused of treason were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The victim was dragged through the streets, half strangled by hanging, and then mutilated while still alive, their body cut open, entrails ripped out and burned before their eyes. Finally, their remains were chopped into quarters and displayed on city gates, a gruesome reminder of royal wrath. Kings and queens stood above the law, and death was their most effective tool of fear. But the cruelty of monarchs was not limited to traitors. Sometimes, their wrath fell upon their own kin. Ivan the Terrible's paranoia grew so monstrous that he struck his own son in a fit of rage, killing the heir to his throne with a blow to the head. The execution of blood ties revealed that power could twist love into violence, turning family into victims of royal fury. In the Ottoman Empire, sultans often ensured stability through fratricide. Brothers of the ruler, seen as potential threats to the throne, were strangled with silk cords in secret chambers. Though hidden from the public eye, these executions were no less savage, for they robbed children and young men of their lives before they ever had the chance to rule. What appeared as royal strategy was, in truth, cruelty disguised as necessity. These punishments were carefully designed to send messages. The tearing of flesh, the breaking of bones, the spilling of blood, each act reminded subjects that the monarch's will was absolute. To disobey was to suffer not only death, but death in the most degrading, unforgettable manner possible. And for those who watched, whether in public squares or whispered accounts, the horror of royal executions lived on long after the screams had faded. As the centuries passed, the echoes of these executions lingered long after the flames had died and the blood had dried. They were not merely punishments, they were instruments of control, woven into the very fabric of monarchy. Subjects who witnessed them carried the images for the rest of their lives, and those who only heard the tales whispered them with trembling voices, passing fear from one generation to the next. Kings ruled not only through laws and armies, but through the terror of knowing that a single misstep could end in an unspeakable fate. In some cases, cruelty backfired. The brutality of executions often sowed resentment that festered into rebellion. In France, the spectacle of royal cruelty fed the flames of revolution. When the guillotine eventually fell on King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, it was more than justice, it was revenge for centuries of blood spilled in the name of the crown. In England, too, the execution of Charles I in 1649 was a symbolic turning point. For the first time, a monarch who had ordered countless deaths was himself condemned, his head severed before a silent, stunned crowd. The people had learned that the throne was not invincible, and that cruelty could devour even the hand that wielded it. Yet, despite these moments of reversal, the legend of savage royal executions continues to haunt history. The Iron Crown, the golden thrones, the jeweled palaces, all glittered with splendor, but beneath them lay shadows of blood and fire. For every king remembered as a just ruler, there were those remembered for their merciless punishments, their names etched into the chronicles of cruelty. What makes these executions unforgettable is not only their brutality, but their symbolism. A noble burned alive, a traitor torn apart, a brother strangled in secret chambers, each act showed the world that royal power was limitless. These deaths were not accidents of history but deliberate performances, meant to remind all who lived under crowns that kings and queens were not merely rulers, they were executioners cloaked in divine right. Today, we look back at these savage acts with horror, struggling to imagine a world where suffering was staged as theater and cruelty was justified as governance. But to understand history is to confront its darkest truths. The story of royal executions is a story of how power corrupts, how fear governs, and how blood was used as the ink to write authority. And though centuries have passed, the legacy of these deaths still whispers through ruined castles and forgotten squares, a chilling reminder that when kings turned cruel, their wrath was more terrifying than any enemy, and their executions shook the very foundations of the world they ruled.